Not really about planes and values so much as it is trying to describe the form. We do have to consider planes and values to a degree, as in terms of why what we're doing works. Like we mentioned, drawn this a lot, but the cylinder is the idea, and we get the sense of like a core shadow and things like that, and this happens because we are thinking about planes and the form relating to the light. But when it comes down to actually drawing this out, we're not so much thinking about this, but this is a bit of a shortcut actually to doing something like this. So when I'm drawing things out, I'm not so much trying to copy what I'm looking at, but I'm trying to describe an idea of the form that's happening. So this one is actually a pretty good example of that. So if I'm drawing something like this out, we can, we don't have to knock this back. Let's just draw this on the side for now. What I'm actually trying to get at or draw is kind of the idea of what's happening, which sounds very abstract and out there, but let's try to explain that. So we're getting a pose like this. She's leaning back. And if you guys look at Carmian, this is a lot of what he's doing with his mark making and how he describes his shapes, shadow shapes and things like that. He's really drawing the idea of what's happening and not necessarily literally what he's seeing. So with something like this, what I'm really thinking about is this idea of the cylinder going back in space like this. And so when I see shadows happening underneath here like this, yeah, we are going to still think about the anatomy here. That's going to influence the shapes that we draw, but they are actually kind of secondary to the form itself. And what I mean by that is, as I come in here and render this out, let's see, with the arms it's kind of obvious, I think, because we're just wrapping around the sense of the cylinder here. But the back is maybe a little less so, simply because of it can get kind of lost in the details here. Let's get this pinch in here, get this arm. So what I'll actually do is come in here and we can describe a lot of these details actually with a line, and there is a theme to the line here. I'm going to disregard her ponytail for now, and hopefully you guys can kind of pick up on this. But what I'm doing here is all of these marks I'm making, they're following around this cylinder. And I'm not so much, again, copying the shadow values or anything that I see. You could even maybe group this stuff together a little bit more here. But what I'm trying to describe is this idea where I'm showing the edge of the cylinder here as her body goes back. So it all actually sort of comes back to cylinders, boxes, and things like that. But this is kind of what I'm thinking about. So all I'm trying to show is that there's a break in the top plane here where the body suddenly turns down, which happens to be in shadow. So when you think of it in those simple terms, we only really need a simple value structure to describe that, right? If we're trying to show this, all we really need is one value to describe that change in the plane. So that's kind of what I'm thinking about a lot with, more so than like the actual planes and values with the shading here. Here I'm either thinking of just turning the cylinder, or even before that I'm just thinking of back and side plane here. And it's the same concept of, we can take a box and turn it into a cylinder by kind of rounding out the corners. When we're doing light and shadow, we can do a similar thing where we take a box and we round it out by bringing in that core shadow here. And suddenly, essentially what we're doing is adding an extra plane here to make it feel rounder. And we can add an extra plane in here by bringing in that wrapping light. So that's kind of the technical thing that we're doing, but it's kind of a shortcut to it. But yeah, the bigger thing is, I'm thinking about this larger form underneath here. What we can do is actually knock this back. Also think about generally like the depth of things. So I think I was telling James earlier about that similar thing. So if you take that same concept here, I'll think about this area being in front. We can bring that forward by emphasizing these shadows a little bit more here. Sorry, I feel like I'm kind of jumping all over the place with these concepts, but let's break down a more kind of solid shape to these. And then we can knock all this back. And I'll generally be thinking of this as one value, as I mentioned, like here. But we can also let that value kind of fall off here. So even though you might see this darker in the reference that you have, it will actually give the drawing more depth if we make it lighter, which sounds kind of ridiculous. But basically the idea here is that I'm thinking of these arms and her shoulders in general as being closer to us than her hips and her legs. So we could actually knock this stuff back a little bit more. And this will be the darkest area. This will be a little bit darker. We can maybe pick some of this up. And, again, if I want to bring in details here, I won't necessarily paint them in, but I've just blocked this in as that one value, following the idea, this is basically just a cylinder rolling back. And then the details I'll bring in more with line. And I'll keep that line darker, closer to the front. And maybe this core shadow here, we can pull that out. It's going to do two things. One, it's going to make that arm feel rounder. And two, because it's darker, it's going to pull it forward a little bit more. And same thing here. This is kind of a subtle shadow right on the edge, but I'm going to go ahead and pull it in a little bit more, just so it has a bit more weight. Make that core shadow darker. Here, we have this cast shadow and this core shadow of her neck. So let's think about the cylinder of her neck. And I just want to show that core shadow here to bring that forward. And it's getting interrupted by this cast shadow, which is then wrapping around her neck. And cast shadows tend to be darker, closer to the thing that's casting it. So we can really go ahead and bring that in as an accent. And we can actually let that kind of fall off as it moves around her neck and back here. Here we want to show the corner of her jaw. It's feeling a little flat now, so we can make it more dimensional by bringing that forward with our core shadow here. And then we're seeing a cast shadow underneath her ear. Like this. So in this case, I might keep her hair actually a little bit lighter. To kind of contrast against the darker core shadow here. And then as her face moves away from us here, we can let that shadow fall off. And that will, again, emphasize the depth, right? But hopefully you see what the difference here. And, you know, again, a lot of what I'm thinking about, there are two things. There's the volume or the roundness of things that I'm trying to, well, it doesn't have to be round, but, you know, the volume of things that I'm trying to emphasize. And then there's also the aspect of depth in terms of what's closer to me and what's further away from us. So you can kind of see the difference here. Right now, all your values are pretty even throughout, and they're even darker back here. And what's happening is that contrast that we see here is calling attention to itself. And so because visually the contrast here wants to come forward, it's competing with the contrast that's happening up here. So that actually kind of flattens the image out, if that makes sense, because we see this detail, which should be further away from us, kind of jumping out to us to the same extent that it's jumping out here. So if we actually push that back, make it lighter, right, that then gives this area with more contrast, it allows it to kind of step forward. So it seems kind of counterintuitive. This stuff in the, you know, which is darker and further away from us, we want to actually make lighter so that it feels further away from us. But that's kind of the idea. Hopefully, again, you can kind of see the difference here. So even with something like this, which is looking pretty cool, again, it's very kind of evenly approached. So what I would say here is we can actually make the line, let's say around this arm, darker, because that's more in the forefront here. We can actually, I know we haven't talked about legs, but since they're here, make this leg darker. And then couple that with our core shadow here being darker, and our shadow in general being darker on this arm. And same thing with the leg. We can push this core shadow darker, and actually the knee would probably be the darkest part here. And let that fall off a little bit. You can start to see the depth of the drawing happen, right? And you know, if you're like painting too, it's kind of the same deal. So even though we aren't being as painterly, the way we're composing with the values, it all applies, right? So corner here, we can bring that forward, let this fall off. So a lot of times when I think about this, I'm really thinking of like pushing and pulling things forward and back. So I want this wrist to feel closer than his elbow, which is a pretty subtle movement, right? There's a subtle angle to this, but still we can bring this forward by making this a little bit darker here and then letting it fall off towards the bottom. And you can see now what we're describing is a tilt to the cylinder, it's tilting this way, right? If we just had a flat shape like this and we did the same thing, we would actually get kind of the same sensation that, you know, this side is closer to us than this side. So the shadow is reinforcing the orientation of the form, which in turn is describing the gesture of his arm in space. So it's actually reinforcing or describing a gesture, which is the important thing, which sounds very crazy and abstract, but that's the deal. So in here, we can bring his chest forward actually by making the shadow here in general a little bit darker. Again, I'm not thinking about planes. I'm just generally thinking that I want this to happen, right? I want to feel the lean of his torso. So I'm doing that by, one, it is, you know, this idea of the cylinder, but I'm also bringing this area closer by making it darker and letting the other areas of it fall off. Hopefully this is making sense. This all seems very conceptual, right? But it's there are a lot of layers to this, I suppose. So, you know, this shoulder gets darker. And even with the line work, you know, we can make it a little bit darker here, a little bit darker in here, and let it fall off as it gets back here. Maybe, you know, if we don't want to lose some of these details, we can bring it in with line. I'm not worrying about planes or rendering per se. And back here, we can push this slider. And it's to the extent where, you know, I want to push this back and not worry about it. Instead of actually having this light in here, which can draw attention to itself, I might just go ahead and knock this all back. Because, you know, it's the contrast really that draws the eye. So if we lessen the contrast, then we can in turn lower the priority of these areas. And, you know, you could still have that light. It's not necessarily a bad thing, right? Because if we have those shadow values in this area generally lighter, it's naturally going to have lower contrast. So if you still, you know, it's up to you basically in terms of how you want to design the drawing. Like, that light looks cool, so maybe we want to keep that also. You have options. But a lot of times if I'm doing like a quick drawing, I won't even worry about that. I'll just knock it back and say the leg is further away from us. Let's see, you know, and so value is one way to bring things forward. Also, things that are more three-dimensional will step forward. So if we also can, you know, bring in some of this stuff in here, you know, wrapping the light. It's going to make these forms feel more three-dimensional. The rest of the stuff back here will remain relatively flat, so they'll kind of naturally push back. So hopefully that makes sense. You know, you can kind of see the difference. You know, like the detail you're painting in here is kind of taking away from the depth of the drawing, right? So if we push that back, have more stuff happening closer to us, that's really what's going to make it feel three-dimensional, despite being a two-dimensional drawing.